Good evening, Year 12s. Welcome to the first video that you'll be viewing over the next 2 months with regard to the analysis and first reading of Rosemary Dobson's poetry. Tonight we're going to be reading and exploring the first poem within the collection that you'll be studying, The Fisherman and the Moon. Hopefully you've done your background reading about the myth of Endymion, as this will be important in your understanding of this poem. Endymion was essentially a man who was in a perpetual sleep for a very long time, but was the object of the goddess of the moon, Selene, and her affection. She visited him every night, obviously as the moon rose, and favoured him in every way, but obviously their love could not come to fruition. So, as we start to read the poem, I want you to keep in mind the themes and concepts that were listed within the timeline document that you have already read, and keep these in mind as we read. I'm going to underline words that I think are important, and I want you to try and think in your mind why I may have highlighted these words and what they could possibly mean. The Fisherman and the Moon. Under these caves, drips that pause, like slow, time-frozen stalactites. And mourning willows stoop to make memorial caverns for their grief. Fisherman, what have you caught tonight? A netted river hall of stars, and a dragged moon that shakes with cold, half drowned in shifting darknesses. Nightly she comes, poor suicide, and murmuring, Endymion, trembles upon the river's brim. I'll throw the stars back in again, but woman or moon, said the fisherman, I'll find that fellow Endymion. He's dead these 1,000 years, I cried. You say so, mused the fisherman? I would have liked a word with him. So now's the time to start to look at the imagery here. We have imagery of water and movement combined with time, which we know is a common theme within Rosemary Dobson's poetry. The interesting thing here, however, is that water, which is often moving and cannot be stopped in many ways, is in fact frozen. We see the fact that the water has fallen from stalactites, which we know are the calcifications that come down from the roof of caves, from water dripping and dripping and dripping, and this water has in fact frozen itself into these stalactites. In the same way, we've got an image, a very similar image of mourning willows which stoop to make caverns for their grief. Excuse my drawing, but we've got some mourning willows here with their leaves down. So we've got a common imagery here of something that is stooping and pausing, which is a quite interesting commonality. We know that within Rosemary Dobson's poetry, she is fascinated with the perpetual movement of time and the fact that as humans we can't stop time, we can't freeze time, and we certainly can't stop the effects of time. So instead, in much of her poetry, she supplements this idea of stopping time with things within nature or things of human creation that do in fact pause a moment in time, which is really, really quite interesting. So later in her poetry, we'll see that art stops time, that paintings and poetry allow us to freeze a moment in time. In this poem, we see things within nature. Willows that dam up water, stalactites that freeze the drops of water that come down from cave roofs. So we have this, again, another pattern that starts to emerge, and it starts to set the tone for the rest of her poetry. We also have a slightly melancholy tone at the beginning, as we're talking about things like death, grief, sadness, and mourning, which is quite an interesting way to start the poem. However, we're not quite sure what she is in mourning for yet, or what the sadness is connected to. All we know is that she is creating this slightly mournful tone to open up her poem. So when we start to move into the myth of Endymion, and we are introduced to the fisherman, we have to ask ourselves questions. Why is the poet or the speaker of the poem sad? And what is to be gained from this sadness? Why is this fisherman fishing within a river? And in particular, why is he netting stars? Is it possible to net stars? Of course we know it's not. So what does that in fact mean? So this is where we start to get into the truly interesting stuff within this poem. We need to ask ourselves, he's netting a river full of stars. Now when you cast a net into a river that's reflecting the sky above you, of course it's going to look like you are in fact catching the stars within the water. Instead, however, we know that this is just a reflection of the stars and a reflection, of course, of the moon. So we need to ask ourselves again, is this fisherman actually fishing for fish or for stars or for moon, or is he in fact fishing for something else? And this is what I want you to bring to class tomorrow. What is he in fact fishing for? Is it for something that is elusive and not real? So what in fact does it mean for a moon to be dragged and half drowned in shifting darkness? Is this darkness real? Is it metaphoric? How does this connect to what you already know about Dobson? What is she often searching for within her poems? If we look at the myth of Endymion here, we know that the original Greek myth is one of yearning, desire, and especially for things that we cannot have. So for Selene, it was yearning for the unattainable Endymion, the beautiful, perfect man that was on the riverbed. For the fisherman, he comes every night searching for the stars and the moon and trying to attain things that he cannot have. So we're starting to see a little bit of a pattern here about yearning and desiring and searching for things that we cannot have. So we must ask ourselves, for Dobson, what is in fact her Endymion? What is her star and moon that she's searching for? And here we get a sense of unity between all three. We see a unity between Selene, the fisherman, and in fact Dobson as a poet. This idea that there is something that is elusive, that is just beyond someone's reach. We see, but we cannot grasp. Does this seem to connect to anything else within her poems that you have read about so far? And finally, we're going to look at the very end of this poem. It's a little bit ambiguous and it's a little bit unclear. So I want you to ask yourself, and you're going to bring this into class tomorrow, why do you think that the final stanza of this poem says that he's dead? That Endymion is in fact dead and has been dead for a long time. And the fisherman seems quite sad about that and insists he would have liked a word with him. Ask yourself, please, before tomorrow.